Right. Well, good evening and welcome to the City of Cedar Falls Planning and Zoning Commission for this Wednesday, October 28th, 2020. And we are again having our meeting via a video conference because of the current pandemic situation. So folks wanting to participate can log into the want to participate and need information, you can log into the city website, I think, and get the information on how to log in. But many of you are probably old hats at that by now. So we will carry on and start with first item is to have the roll call, and I'll ask Ms. Howard to take the roll call.
Okay, good evening. Hartley?
Here.
Holst?
Here.
Larson?
Here.
Leeper?
He was here.
Didn't hear. I see that Mr. Leeper's online here. Did he fall off again? Maybe. Oh, here he comes in. He had trouble maybe connecting. Lynch?
Here.
Prideaux?
Here.
Saul?
Here.
Schrod?
Here.
And Leeper. Okay.
Here.
All right. Shelley is absent tonight. All right. I think that's it.
All right, great. Thank you, Karen. So we have a quorum. At this point, I would invite any public comments for anybody on the attendees list who would like to make a public comment on anything that is not on the agenda tonight. I'll take a quick look to see if there's any raised hands. Seeing none, we will move on from public comments and review the approval of the minutes. Sorry, I got things out of order there. Jumped ship a little bit, but we will do the approval of the minutes.
I reviewed all 4 pages of the minutes of last meeting, which was rather lengthy, but I found no need to change anything, so I make a motion to approve.
I would second.
Moved and seconded. I'll take a voice vote. All in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. All right, we'll skip back over public comments since we got in early. And we have one item of old business tonight, and that is a rezoning from R4 multiple residence district to C3 commercial district. And who is going to introduce that tonight?
Mr. Weintraub's going to introduce that tonight, but I'll share my screen here.
All right, excellent.
Good evening, everyone. As you recall, this was before you at the last meeting, and it came in right after the presentation for the College Hill District. This property is located at the northeast corner of 22nd and College. It's where the Bonnie's Vape and Liquor Store is located. The owner is S&G Pack. The proposal is to rezone 4/10 of an acre of property, and they're putting the entire property up for rezoning because at the time the zoning maps were drawn, they weren't sure whether they would get the whole boundary. They want to make sure that R4 gets to C3, so they described the entire parcel. This commercial building was built in 1964. As we mentioned, it is the current Bonnie's location. Next slide, please. As far as the future land use map and comprehensive plan, the area is shown as being neighborhood commercial mixed use. And so what they're proposing is a commercial type of use. The comprehensive plan encourages bringing mixed use development to the College Hill area between 21st and 22nd Street to provide that link from the upper hill to the lower hill and make the area a more cohesive and walkable area. Next, please. The site is in a developed area, so it has water, sanitary sewer, and storm service available. Next slide. The site currently has access to both College and 22nd Street. These have wide curb cuts, obviously probably a holdover from when it was maybe a gas station passed. These access standards do not meet the current city standards or the College Hill Overlay District, so they're non-conformance in any redevelopment of property. This will be looked at and addressed for some type of conformity. Next, please. We have a couple of photos. So this is showing the site currently, and you see that the parking lot and the sidewalk kind of bleeds together. Next comment. The staff recommends approval of the request to rezone 4/4 of an acre of the property located at 2128 College Street from, again, the C3 commercial and R4 multi-residence district to the C3 commercial district. The last meeting, the architect, Dan Levy, spoke on behalf of the project and mentioned that the owner had been in contact with the consultants for the College Hill area and was interested in some possible redevelopment plans. Catherine Sogard from the College Hill Partnership read a letter of support for the rezoning, and we just recommend this take the next step to the council.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. Let me check the attendees list, see if there's anybody here to comment on this proposal. If so, raise your hand. I'm not seeing anyone. So bring it back to the commission.
I jumped the gun last time and said I thought it was a great project and thought it made sense to move forward, so I'd make a motion to approve.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Been moved and second. Is there any discussion? I think it's a pretty straightforward cleaning up a little problem that didn't need to exist. So, any other comments? If not, Karen, I'll ask you to do a roll call vote.
Okay, Hartley,
Aye.
Holst,
Aye.
Larson,
Aye.
Leeper,
Aye.
Lynch,
Aye.
Prideaux,
Aye.
Saul,
Aye.
Schrod.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Motion carries. So that'll move on to City Council. We have one item of new business on the calendar tonight, and that is a site plan review, a Highway 1 highway commercial for a new project. And who is going to introduce that tonight?
Mr. Seavey is going to introduce this item.
All right, Chris, you are on.
Okay. Okay, so the applicant is proposing a car wash where an existing car wash sits. This is in the middle of the block between Walmart Drive and Andrea Drive, south of Brandolin. Next slide. This is in the Highway 1 district, which is intended to promote general service commercial uses that serve a broader market area. All proposed site plans in the Highway 1 district require review by this body and by council. This is the first meeting that will be for discussion purposes only. As you can see, the proposal complies with the setback requirements for both building and landscaping. Next slide. Just to look at some features of the site and the site plan, the tidal wave car wash concept is new to Cedar Falls, but has gained popularity elsewhere. It is a drive-through model designed for high throughput. There is a 2-lane pay station, 1 elongated automatic car wash bay, and 19 canopied vacuum stalls that are free for patrons, free of charge, I mean. So the number of employee stalls is 3, and that certainly meets the requirement for this use. Next slide. As far as landscaping, the proposal meets all requirements for green space, plantings, screening, street trees, and interior landscaping. There are 3 species of trees proposed and 3 species of other plants proposed. I don't know if there's much else to say about this, but next slide. Here are renderings of the proposed building. The scale and proportion of the new building will be similar to the existing building and the surrounding buildings. It is next door to an IHOP and a McDonald's. It is 1 story with 14-foot wall heights and a 612 roof pitch. Let's see. Here are some aspects of different facade elements. They use an attractive stone veneer and other concrete and masonry elements. Kind of an earth tone look with the blue roof. So, next slide. Proposed signage meets all the setback requirements of the zone. Here you can see the monument sign and the menu signs, and some directional signage and a wall sign that would go above the doors of the wash bay, and then also some signs that go on the enclosure of the dumpster. As far as we've been able to tell, all of this, well, I shouldn't say as far as we can, this meets the requirements of the signage aspects of the Highway 1 zone. And yeah. Next slide. So as this says, this is for discussion at this point. There are a few kinks to work out with the applicant. But we'll bring this to another meeting and just look forward to having some input here from the commission.
All right, thank you, Mr. Seaton. So what kind of kinks are you still working out?
So we just barely received a complete set a couple days back.
Okay.
As you can see, and Karen went back to this the landscape plan. You can see the 20-foot landscaped setback is not shown on here as it was on the first slide.
Gotcha.
So we did receive the full set, and we'll evaluate that before we take it to you next time.
Right. So yeah, because we're going to review this tonight for general input, and then it'll be on the next meeting for actual action.
Exactly.
Okay.
As is typical in these cases.
All right. Very good. Do we have? Let me get back here to anybody in attendance tonight who is? Yep. It's like John. Let me see if I can. John, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. My name is John LaPointe. I'm with Brightwork Real Estate. We're the ones developing the Tidal Wave Auto Spa. Just wanted to introduce myself and say thank you to Chris more specifically. We do have some kinks that we needed to work out, but working with staff has been phenomenal, and I believe we have a great product to provide Cedar Falls, and look forward to getting in front of you. And just wanted to make sure if I'm here, if you had any questions specific, that I was here to answer it for.
Great. Much appreciated, John.
No problem.
And since we don't have very many attendees, I don't think there's anybody else to speak. So I will bring this back to the commission for any discussion, comments. As mentioned, this is just for discussion tonight and to get our input, and it will be on the next meeting for a vote.
Well, thank you so much, and have a great night, and I appreciate all the help along the way.
Great. Thanks, John.
Well, it looks pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I don't have any major concerns. There's a car wash there now. This is just a different type. In fact, it probably looks a little nicer than what's there now. So
Right.
it seems consistent with the other development right there in the area. So I wouldn't have any problems.
Nope.
Cool.
Do you know, was the original car wash, did it get a tax rebate or a property tax incentive or not?
No, the city doesn't provide tax incentives for retail.
Okay.
just in
Thank
our
you.
industrial parks.
Any other comments anybody would like to make? If not, we can move that right along and look forward to seeing it most likely on the next meeting.
I have a quick question. In the past, we've talked about something that might be seemingly straightforward, and if about fast tracking it. Is this one of the things we might consider for that?
I think since we have just received the updated plans and didn't have them before your packet went out, we'd like to take another look at those updated plans and bring those back forward so we make sure that we have everything that meets the requirements. So Chris kind of went quickly through that, but we want to make sure that it meets the setback requirements of the zone and that the plans are all ready to go to council.
Okay, that makes sense. Looks good.
All right. Well, hearing no further discussion, we will move that along and move on to, we have a couple items under zoning code text amendments being proposed by the city. So the next item is a subdivision code text amendments, final plat phasing. And who is introducing that tonight?
I'll handle that
right.
discussion. I think we discussed this back in August, I believe. We had a couple meetings to discuss this particular item. So I'll take a little bit of time to go back through what we discussed previously since it's been some time. Just to review, our subdivision code is intended to establish standards for the design of subdivisions to make sure that there's adequate provision for public facilities and services, and so that the growth in the community occurs in an orderly manner consistent with the comp plan and to promote the public health and safety and general welfare of the citizens. So this is also what mirrors the language in the Iowa code as well. So that is the reason that we review subdivisions through the commission and the council. There's two stages to subdivision code review. The preliminary plat, which shows all of the elements to show how it fits into the community, all the public improvements, the layout of the streets and blocks, any sensitive environmental features and how those would be protected or mitigated. How that new development will fit into the larger community. This is done to ensure that it will be designed to protect the interest of both current and future property owners in the neighborhood. To ensure that those particular goals are met, the code does require that owners include the entirety of their contiguous holdings on the preliminary plat. So we got to have a good sense of how this fits into the larger community. With a final plat, it's the obligation of the owner developer to design and construct all of those public improvements that are necessary to support the development. The cost of those improvements are then incorporated into the price of the lots that are made available for sale once that final plat is approved. And of course, with larger developments, the land is often final platted in phases based on the pace of development because the construction of the improvements is an upfront cost that's captured upon the sale of the lots. So we have recently received quite a few complaints in the city from residents and concern on the part of the city council regarding final plat phasing. We don't currently have in our subdivision code specific rules regarding final plat phasing. While we do request it at the preliminary plat stage, it's been largely left up to the developer to determine the order of development. In some cases, this practice has resulted in critical street and infrastructure connections that have remained unfinished. As we had discussed previously, an incomplete or inefficient street pattern has both short-term and long-term costs to the community as a whole. So that is what we're trying to address here. poorly planned subdivision phasing, particularly when combined with a poorly connected street network, has a number of things that are problematic for the community, including increased commute times, burdening certain streets with excess traffic, which impacts homeowners along those routes in particular, safety concerns for pedestrians along the congested routes, particularly children, increased driver frustration and speeding along these routes that are because people are frustrated, increased emergency response times when there's lack of connections, and inefficient routing for utilities and services such as refuse pickup and snow plowing. So there's just a number of consequences if we don't take these things into account as we're both looking at the phasing and looking at the street connections within our subdivisions when those are approved. So just to provide an example, we discussed this the last time, but here's an example, and there are likely other ones in the community that we can point to, but this is one that's been discussed and is of concern at the moment. Here you can see Prairie Winds, Prairie West, the area near and around Aldrich Elementary School, and of course the concerns we received about congestion along Eric Road, the lack of the last street connection from Ashworth over to Aldrich Elementary School would provide that additional route over to the elementary school. Also Ironwood to the north up to Green Hill would provide a needed route for all these residents that have bought homes in these subdivisions to be able to commute to work, to other destinations in the community. So this is an example of an issue where if the subdivision had been platted in a different manner, and it wouldn't have necessarily cost any additional cost to the developer. It was just a matter of which subdivision plat phase happened first. So here you can see the phasing plan that was submitted, I think back in 2014 with, just to continue to pick on Prairie Winds here, because it illustrates this particular issue. Here we have the phasing plan that was submitted with the preliminary plat. And as you can see, phase 5, which would complete Ashworth, eventually the developer didn't complete phase 5 all in one phase. They then requested an additional phase. They've only subdivided a portion of phase 5. And unfortunately, the portion that they chose to develop first was this cul-de-sac in the middle of this development, rather than having the connection over to the school built first. So I think with the provision that's proposed tonight, it's just a quality check. It's a reminder both to developer, to the staff, to the Planning and Zoning Commission, the City Council, that we should be keeping an eye on this sort of thing and working with the developers to come up with, when we have the situation where they did not want to final plat this all in one phase as they originally had proposed, to take a look at that and say, okay, then which one is the critical connection here? Probably should do that connection first. And it didn't mean any more street length here. It didn't mean any additional cost. It was just a timing issue. I brought this slide at the last discussion just to sort of illustrate also the point is we've changed our platting and subdivision over the decades, and you can see the older part of town and how many connections we used to have when we had more of a gridded street pattern. Now, it doesn't necessarily always need to be a gridded street pattern, but it illustrates a point. If you have many connections, there are multiple routes to get into any one destination, so that none of these routes then become congested. And if there's any emergencies or anything, there's always an alternative route for travelers to get to their destination. With the newer subdivisions, we've gone away from that a little bit. We haven't kept an eye toward that always, and it's been a little bit to the detriment to the community with increased traffic congestion and issues about connectivity, issues about incomplete streets, and phasing of development. So as we discussed previously and in the memo in your packet, the first step is really just establish a standard for final plat phasing to ensure that critical infrastructure connections occur prior to less critical areas of a subdivision. This would give flexibility to the developer to propose phases that meet the pace of market demand, but would then give discretion to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council to determine if the final plat phase can function as an independent development and ensure that no essential infrastructure improvements are being circumvented or delayed with the proposal for the phasing. There is a next step, and one of the things we've been discussing, I think in a number of different cases, is to consider street connectivity standards in our subdivision code so that they're more clear and consistently applied. Street connectivity standards can provide standards for multiple street stubs to the subdivision boundaries to allow continuation of the street pattern to the adjacent properties. Those standards can limit the block lengths so that they're more consistent and provide more connections. And then enforce the existing restriction that we have in our code right now on cul-de-sacs, be more consistent about that, and establish a standard for intersection spacing along our major roadways. There's also been a concern expressed recently about consideration of requirements for temporary construction access while a subdivision is being constructed, to take that construction traffic off of the neighborhood streets. If there's a way to get a temporary road in while a subdivision is being constructed, that will just help relieve some of that construction traffic. So those are some things to consider that we'll be bringing forward in the future. So we won't be discussing those more tonight, but just to give you a heads up that these are some things we are thinking about that might be worthy of consideration. At the last meeting, you had asked what other cities are doing with regard to final plat phasing. Staff researched various codes and reached out to the planning staff at a number of cities: Ames, Iowa City, Urbandale, Ankeny, Sioux City, Bettendorf, and Council Bluffs. A number of these cities require phasing plans as a part of the submittal process. And 4 of these communities address critical infrastructure through separate development agreements. And Iowa City does include a clause similar to what staff is proposing. This was adopted in 2008 to address similar concerns that had been expressed in their community about the completion of critical infrastructure. That at that point in time, Iowa City was updating their entire subdivision code and included a number of improvements, including this one that had been of concern to the community. So with regard to the communities that have separate development agreements about phasing, I think one of the points that we would like to make here is that development agreements are great, but they do take a lot of time to draft and to bring forward, and it slows down the process a little bit in certain cases. And so if we were to require something like that for every single subdivision, now some subdivisions, a development agreement is needed to address, if they're a master planned community, for example. But for every subdivision, that may actually be more onerous requirement than just having something in the code that, if we need it, is there for us to take and put an eye toward the phasing plans. The commission also requested at your last consideration of this language to formalize the practice of requiring a phasing plan at the time of preliminary plat. Like I said, we typically as a practice do get some phasing plans, but it's not something that's specifically codified. Staff does agree with that request and finds that codification will provide clarity to the review process. So proposes some language in the subdivision code for a submittal requirement for a phasing plan is shown on the screen here and as discussed in your packet. Staff is bringing the proposed amendments forward to address a problem we are experiencing here in Cedar Falls. Like I said, the city has received numerous complaints from residents in certain parts of the city. Concerns have also been expressed by the city council about traffic congestion and safety concerns caused by delays in extending critical street segments. So these proposed amendments will focus attention on this aspect of land development to help prevent these situations in the future. So the proposed language is drafted to ensure that each subdivision will be reviewed on its own merits. All unique circumstances and characteristics can be considered. So this is, I think there was a concern expressed that this was a blanket approach, but this is really exactly the opposite of a blanket approach. Every subdivision will be considered on its own because of course, every part of this community is a little bit different. So this just allows the commission and the council to take these things into account when you're reviewing those subdivision plats. And as I said, it will serve also as a quality control reminder when we have standards that are expressed in the code. It's a reminder to staff, to the Planning Zoning Commission and City Council, that's something that we should have our eye toward while we're reviewing the plats. So in conclusion, also providing clear direction in the code will ensure that the rules are applied consistently and fairly. We hear that quite a bit from developers is if we want to have standards, we should put them in the code. And so, so that they're consistently and fairly applied over time. Requiring one development phase to occur prior to a less critical phase. I think one of the things concerned about was increasing cost to the developer. This doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be any additional cost to the developer. You know, the cost of installing a 300-foot segment of street is recaptured with the sale of lots on either side of that street. So requiring a different 300-foot segment of street to be constructed first would not necessarily increase cost to the developer, but it might mean a more efficient travel route for the community and help reduce community costs and achieve some benefits in the community as well. So finally, the provision will ensure that a subdivision is not platted in a manner that leaves out one small segment of critical infrastructure that is then unlikely to ever be completed except by the city at taxpayer expense. And what I'm talking about here is allowing a subdivision to be platted all the phases until the last 5 or 6 lots, something like that, where it's just a small segment of road so that it, you know, that can sit there then for a long time. The developer may determine that it's not something that they want to complete or finish. And so it can then sit there and it then might become across to the city as something to pay for at taxpayer expense. So the language I've put here on the screen is the proposal. It's just a 1-paragraph amendment to the subdivision code in the final plat requirements. So you can see that here on the screen, and I'm happy to discuss any aspect of that particular provision or the wording of that in your discussion tonight. With that, the Community Development Department recommends that the Commission discuss and make a recommendation to City Council on the proposed amendments to Chapter 20 subdivisions.
Great, thanks, Ms. Howard. So there's 2 kind of pieces of this, if I understood it right. There's one for the immediate addition, and then you're looking to come back with those further zoning amendments at a future date for review. Then is that, did I get that right?
Yeah, so I think the reason we talked about street connectivity because it has been a topic of discussion at a number of cases recently and in the community in general. And it really ties in with this final plat phasing issue that we're having. So we wanted to put that sort of into your thinking and have in your consideration, just to give you a heads up that we will probably be bringing something forward about street connectivity standards that relate to this. But that's not what we're considering tonight.
Yeah, so for tonight is the kind of the one paragraph addition that basically states that we're requiring a plan with phasing initially when a subdivision is platted.
So there's two paragraphs. One, in the submittal requirements for the preliminary plat,
Yep.
there would be a requirement stated in the code that a phasing plan is required if the developer is planning to develop in phases. Now, it
Right.
might be a small subdivision without phases and they wouldn't need that. But if they're
Right.
anticipating doing it in phases, they'd need to submit that phasing plan with their preliminary plat.
Right.
And then the second paragraph would be in the final plat submittal. That's when it would state clearly that a final plat is, if they're platting in phases, that they can do that, but we would then consider and make sure that that final plat that they're proposing is something that can support itself with all the
Right, so-
infrastructure just in that final plat phase, and won't leave out any critical street connections or infrastructure.
Well, that'd be kind of the case as if they're varying from what was originally proposed for the original phasing.
Right, if there was there'd be probably a number of different scenarios that might trigger this. One, like you said, if they decided to phase it in a different manner than what they had originally proposed for whatever reason, we know that a number of these subdivisions take years to build out. The other situation might occur is that there might be some changes in the area, in the neighborhood around the subdivision, such that now there's a new destination or something where we know the traffic is already having some issues. And so there's a new destination in the neighborhood, and we might want to look at altering the phasing or adjusting the phasing to address that concern.
Right.
The first paragraph, 21, seems reasonably honest and straightforward. As I read it, it's basically just an instrument for requiring the formal phase planning as one of the submittal items. And all the language beyond that, just kind of a general justification for it. So I think as a line item or a checklist item for submittal, I think something largely like that makes sense. One question, there was a couple of the cities that did not do development agreements for this sort of thing that had language. Do we have samples of the language that they used in their zoning code?
For which, Kyle?
You had mentioned that of the several cities that were contacted, that there were a couple that actually had some language in their zoning code to this effect.
The only one that had language to this effect is Iowa City, and that was in your staff report.
Okay, so all of the other ones handle it on a case-by-case basis through development agreement if needed.
And Iowa City does as well. It's on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
But they have language in the code that addresses the intent of what that's for.
Okay, yeah. and that is what this is based on, more or less. Is that correct?
Right. Every subdivision is different, so every subdivision is considered on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, so the second paragraph, number 2, is a little bit more interesting, I guess. So it says that a phase would need to stand on its own. Am I reading that right?
Right. So if you're going to build, we don't know how long it will take to build out a subdivision. So if you're going to bring in 20 lots for development, you need to be able to show that, for example, stormwater management will be handled with the plat that you're doing, that all the infrastructure necessary to support that is going to be in place. Excuse me. since we don't know when the rest of the subdivision will be built out, it will need to stand on its own so that it doesn't create problems for the rest of the area.
So
That's what that means.
if we could keep picking on Prairie Winds and Prairie West, the first phase of Prairie West, where Gloria and Donald Drive were extended, that wouldn't have stood on its own today, or then, if it were to be its own thing. And I believe the reason that it wouldn't is because of the fire access to, 30 units that are required with a secondary exit. Is that correct? 30?
Right. So if there's more than 30 developed on a single means of access, that's why that second access was eventually required, right?
But a second access wasn't necessarily practical in 2013 because the land to the north was owned by a different owner, and there wasn't a way to do that without. I don't know. The way I read this, if we were to apply this as I'm reading it, Prairie West and Prairie Winds would have never happened. So I'm kind of curious. If we're, it's easy to call out the issues with Prairie Winds and Prairie West in retrospect, and I think largely, that's a big development. Over 100 acres, and so if we're talking about, in retrospect, I'd like to kind of know how this would have helped with the conditions that were present at the time. In 2013, there was really not even talk of a new school yet. The new school kind of resulted from this development, and then the Ironwood connection. I mean, that wasn't. It was something that needed to happen at some point and was kind of planned for, but it's a little bit of a roll of the dice on the city's part too. If the first phase of Prairie West wasn't able to extend beyond that for financial reasons or whatever, that if there's a reason for it, I mean, the city has every ability to pave a road that's deemed critical if need be, if those conditions were to change. And that's something that I feel like would be a city council thing. So I guess my question is what would have happened differently in Prairie Winds and Prairie West with this?
So I think with Prairie Winds, that phasing plan, if it were developed as they originally proposed, they would have needed to put in all that infrastructure for that entire phase 5. But as you know, a preliminary plat allows you to start constructing your improvements. And so when the developer came to the city and said, we don't want to plat the entirety of phase 5 in one phase, we would like to do it in more than one phase. I think that's a point in time which, but they had already started constructing some of those roads. So I think at that point it was really I think a question about, the question should have come up earlier, that if that final plat phase of phase 5 was so large that it was unlikely to get developed all in one phase, that is the point at which the discussion should have been, how should that be phased? Which of those road segments should have been developed first? And at that point in time, Aldrich Elementary School was already there. So, so we would have known, with this to remind us as we're reviewing those final plat proposals that, hey, maybe we should connect Ashworth segment of that first before we do what is currently then phase 5, which is the cul-de-sac portion of it. So I think that is how it would have changed it. And with regard to your comment about the secondary access, that's a fire code thing. And so you're allowed to develop up to a certain number of lots before you have secondary access. But that was imposed on this subdivision. From my understanding, it was a little before my time here, but that's why that second road was required before they could develop any more lots. And that is something that's a fire code requirement. So that's already in the code. Everybody
Which
has to
section
be ready.
would have been a requirement?
I'm sorry, what?
Which
was that?
section road would have been required?
So the Harriet Lane connection was their secondary means of access. That's what they proposed as a secondary means of access before they could develop any more lots.
We're talking about where Prairie Winds and Prairie West connected several years ago. Are we talking about the same thing there?
I'm not sure. Prairie Winds is the one with the secondary access. That was provided with Prairie West.
Right.
Or Prairie, which prairie are we talking here?
Well, so presumably though, if we're requiring a phasing plan with the preliminary plat initially, that phasing plan, if implemented, should be fine, because at that point you would have just, I don't think you approve that phasing plan without feeling that it is, that it meets all these criteria for the proper, proper stages of development, so that that phase has already been determined that will be, that will be self-supporting of the utilities and access and that type of thing. When it was laid out initially, it would only be, in my mind, as if somebody wants to then vary from that initial phase plan, that you would run into potential issues where access and utilities might not be developed to the city's needs, based on that variance from the initial planning. That's how I view the process working if you're going to do this.
Yeah, ideally, that's how it would work. I think this provides one additional adjustment, so somebody doesn't have to go back and redo their preliminary plat and their phasing plan. Then what they would just need to do is bring forward a final plat phasing that makes an adjustment then. So this would allow at the final plat phase to consider the phasing that's proposed at the time based on the current conditions.
Right, so you could modify.
We know things can change over time. So it could actually be to the benefit of the developer as well. If conditions have changed and they've decided we would like, for whatever reason, we feel that we want to develop this portion of it first, they can request that. It just allows a lot more flexibility, but yet sets the standard and makes sure that we're considering all the aspects. And then, the Planning and Zoning Commission, City Council can say yes or no. I think it's full discretion at that point. It just gives some guidance in the code for those various situations.
So back to Prairie Winds, Prairie West. Let's say that paragraph 21 there anyway, were in effect, and we were thinking about we're going back to 2013 now, and the phasing plan that was submitted, albeit largely conceptual, I think, and I think preliminary plats to an extent are somewhat conceptual, are they not? I guess, let me touch on that for a second. So preliminary plat is, how finalized does that have to be? How much fluctuation can there be from a preliminary plat to a final plat without having to submit and approve the preliminary plat?
So according to the code, any substantial change, the final plat basically has to be in substantial compliance with the preliminary plat. In other words, you can't change the roads, you can't change the alignments, you can't change any significant aspects of a subdivision without going back through the preliminary plat stage to replat it. So that can be considered at that time. Okay,
so in the case of Prairie Winds then, if we had that phasing plan that you'd shown where the phase 5 was double what it is becoming, if the developer wanted to break that into 2 phases, then they would need to submit a revision request for the phasing plan, and then that would have one reading at the commission and at council then? Is that how that process would work?
Well, that's not how it's been working. I guess that's the point, is that we haven't had a process. phasing plan wasn't a submittal requirement. It was something we asked for.
Is
So I
that
think
how it would work?
the final plat phasing then, so with this provision, let me think about that question. So if they came to us and said, okay, we want to split that phase 5 into 2 phases, or even 3 phases, however they want to do it, we would take a look at this final plat. We wouldn't have to go back to the preliminary plat because they're not changing any road alignments, any physical aspects of the plat. They're just asking to change the phasing. So we would look at this paragraph 2 in the final plat stage, and it says, in response to the pace of market demand, the subdivider may final plat only a portion of the development illustrated on the preliminary plat. If it can function as a separate development, so then we can consider that at the final plat stage that, okay, they aren't following their phasing plan they did with the preliminary plat, but this makes some sense. And we're making sure that the important connections are made first. There's a chance for everyone to review those aspects of it before the city would approve that final plat. So you wouldn't have to go then back through that preliminary plat stage again.
So, sorry, Leanne, go ahead.
So basically on that particular one, phase 5, city would have then said, no, you can't, you can do the cul-de-sac, but you have to do Ashworth all the way to whatever road that is.
I think it would have engendered a conversation
Right.
about, let's consider doing Ashworth first.
Right.
And then doing the cul-de-sac as the next phase.
Right.
If staff and the developer are in agreement with, say, splitting a phase into 2, using this as an example, there wouldn't be any special process. It would, paragraph 2 would be granting the autonomy to staff to say, okay, yeah, it makes sense. We can split that into 2. We're in agreement that it needs to be Ashworth first, and then just proceed with the regular final plat approval as it would go ordinarily. Am I understanding that right?
Right, and I want to make it clear, the staff doesn't approve the plat. The Planning and Zoning Commission considers it and makes a recommendation to the council. So, the staff does work with the developer on what we think is a good plan to move forward, and then we would bring it, of course, to you. And if there's some sort of disagreement about the phasing, I think it could be heard then in the public forum and could be debated then. But yes, that's ostensibly what we might have done, is ask them to consider extending Ashworth first, but brought it to the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council to approve that.
So even with this language, the developer would have an option to, if they disagreed with the any revisions to the phasing, if there was a disagreement, it could still, a final plat could still be submitted for review even if it didn't have staff approval, and it would be a point of conversation then. Am I understanding that right as well?
And that's true with anything that's required. The staff is not the decision-making body here. The city council is. So anybody has the right to bring something forward with or without staff recommendation of approval. So that's always the case.
Last thing I want to touch on, sorry, I don't want to drag this out. What kind of measures are in place to kind of enforce the timing? So say it's deemed that there's a critical arterial connection and everybody feels that needs to happen within a certain time. Obviously the viability of that is based on market conditions. What happens when it doesn't go as quickly, or if it's something that's that severe, would there still be a development agreement?
I don't know if I can always answer all the what ifs in every scenario. Of course, everything would be considered on its own merits at the time. I think the point here is that the developer is making a decision about how many lots can be absorbed within a construction season, perhaps. They know what their bottom line is and that sort of thing. So I think it's a matter of really diving into then making sure that the final plats are set out or the phasing plan is set out so that we're not setting ourselves up for failure. In other words, that not too many lots are considered in each phase, so that when the phasing plan comes forward, we're looking at those critical connections and making sure that we're kind of numbering those phases appropriately. Now, we don't always know how long it's going to take to build out because, of course, the market conditions change. But I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I think as much as we can predict things, I guess that's what we would be looking toward.
Well, let's keep, I feel bad we keep picking on Prairie West, but let's just look at Prairie West and the Ironwood connection to Green Hill. So let's also pretend that it's back in 2013 and we've got this new insight that we have today in this language in force. And let's also pretend that the developer owned the that commercial frontage along Green Hill, and Green Hill were there. None of those things were there back then, but let's just say they were, and we're identifying that Ironwood is a critical connection to Green Hill. So I guess my question is that northerly section of the development would largely, I mean, I don't know this, but I would assume being along Green Hill that it would be higher density residential or commercial or something different than the single family housing that you see in Prairie West. Different kind of development, different absorption, all kinds of different factors in place. You know, if the investment just isn't the right investment to make, what means does the city have to enforce putting a road in that has no payback or no immediate payback in this Ironwood situation? Is it something that could be, you know, enforced in such a way financially? I guess I'm just wondering how that would work, or if it's more or less just a consideration in initial review and nothing beyond that.
Well, I think we don't all have a crystal ball here, so I don't know if I can answer that question definitively. The city certainly has powers to build roads and assess back to the property owners the cost of those roads. Certainly it's not the direction we would always like to go. But certainly there's a lot of different means of doing things. What we're trying to do here is just come up with a reasonable plan that's clear and consistent in the code to address these kind of situations so that everybody has the flexibility, but yet we're all put on notice that we should be looking at these things from the preliminary plat stage as they're laying out the, you know, because at the preliminary plat stage, there's no street pattern, right? We're looking at the street pattern that they're proposing and making sure that it's connected, or making sure that it makes sense with the way the development is proposed and how those street connections are handled. Not just the phasing plan, but every aspect of it at the preliminary plat stage. So I think the more clear and objective standards we can have in our code to help guide us as we're reviewing that, both at the staff level, for the developers and for the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council, the better. At least
I largely agree with that. I'm just curious, back to Ironwood. Let's say the entire Prairie Winds and West development were to happen now today, and we fast forward down the road, and Ironwood, let's say things dried up and Ironwood never got connected. What would be the remedy for that? And is it any different than it would be prior to some of this language? Does this language give us any new authority there, or does it not really address that?
But I think what would happen, Kyle, is you wouldn't be in that situation where you now need to connect it, because some of these other phases would have been probably not approved without either that connection or some other connection deemed appropriate developed. So we didn't have an overabundance of, you know, people relying on only one road exit. You know, in order to develop the next 30 lots or whatever, there would have had to be there, you know, another connection, that Ironwood connection, or the potential connection, additional connection to to Hudson Road that doesn't exist and things like that. I think that's what it would have forced its hand.
Well, that kind of takes me back to where Prairie West might not exist under this logic, because we would have needed a crystal ball to realize that the developer might eventually buy more land, and that Green Hill's going to eventually exist someday, and that there's going to need to be this major north-south arterial connection. And I know we're trying to just do better, but when I apply some of this logic backwards, it kind of kills it. And that's what I'm wondering if I guess what I'm saying with Ironwood, for example, if let's say the last phase of Prairie West there that is along Ironwood there, I don't remember the streets, and maybe the area along Green Hill to the north. Let's say those couple of phases, let's say those never happened. Obviously it would be, there's enough there to what's to the south that Ironwood connection is pretty important. But if the developer isn't able to continue building because it's not economically viable, does the developer now have to put those roads in anyway? Or is it something where the city could just put that in and assess it as suggested?
Right. That would probably have to happen. So Kyle, there's nothing here that forces, there's nothing here that's a remedy to that situation. We've already got the situation here with Prairie Winds and Prairie West. These solutions are too late for the situation in those particular cases, because we're up with the final plats of both the entire subdivision. We're at the final stages of those subdivisions. What these were intended to do is to help us to make better decisions for future subdivisions as we're considering those.
So
however, his point is, if we have a future project, a future large preliminary plat with phases, that, let's say we go past Union Road and we're going out that direction and there's nothing to connect to, okay? Again, what he's saying is, with these in place, would that kill a project? Could that possibly kill a project?
I don't see how this would kill a project. What this is just standards to review the subdivision that's before you at the time.
But that's our problem.
Right. So
that's our problem. We look at each one individually before us at the time, not knowing what the future is, but then the future brings us a new problem.
And
But I think that this clarifies to make sure that each phase of whatever development, future development is that as an entity, that it has connectivity, right, within each phase, so that it's thoughtful throughout the process of the development. I think that's what it's, I mean, so that no matter what.
To Green Hill wasn't even an option before. So now it's easy to say, oh yeah, we should have had that there because it's an option now, and I think it's the same ownership of Prairie West, and then the funny shaped piece up along the Green Hill Drive area or Green Hill Road area. That is really easy now, but if you go back in time, that land wasn't an option. So if there wasn't a viable way for the same developer to on contiguously owned land, as that was mentioned earlier, to make that critical infrastructure, would it not work? Would Prairie West not have been allowed to be that big thing without a plan to connect Ironwood that is controllable by that developer? Or is that something where we can just assume that there will be a connection to Ironwood at some point? And
that's why we ask developers to stub streets to their property boundary in logical locations. So that's a kind of a different issue than what this is intended to address. So I don't think there's anything here that would prevent development from occurring. And of course, it always occurs over time. So these are just standards in place to help us both at the preliminary plat stage, when it's what's considered a larger area, of course, we're going to have to consider, you know, as the city grows, okay, how many, that's where those street connectivity standards come in. If we have some standards in place later, that we bring to you later, that says, okay, we are anticipating the city will grow. And so every about 600 feet, we're going to need to have a street stub to the property boundary. So it allows, unless there's some major impediment or something like that in the way, environmental feature or something like that, that would just allows the next developer to pick up that road, or the same developer to pick up that road and continue it to the next piece of property. It's all about sort of setting ourselves up for success.
Okay. Well, I guess it seems like that really isn't a change from what we've been used to, just doing the best that we can and trying to add some additional tools into the toolbox to help us do so. So I'd be largely supportive of that. I was just reading through both of these again, kind of word for word, and I guess I like the intent by and large, but the one thing I keep coming back to that really bugs me is the on the paragraph 2, where it parenthetically says, if the said final plat phase can function as a separate development. I think if we removed that one little parenthetical in there, the rest of it makes a lot more sense. I just feel like that being able to stand on its own, it would be too easy to use that to to roadblock anything, and that's the part that I feel like is the kind of messes up the rest of it in my mind. Any other thoughts on that? Anyone?
I mean, it's somewhat of a subjective piece, so I don't know.
Well, most development phases honestly can't survive on their own. They're always dependent to a future connection. We're talking about stubbing streets out and all that sort of thing.
I just want to make sure that we're understanding what that means.
Okay.
So what that means is, say they're bringing forward 20 lots, and we're saying, okay, we're going to look at the stormwater management here. You've got adequate stormwater management proposed to support these 20 lots, because we don't know when you're going to bring the next 20 lots online. And we want to make sure that your stormwater isn't going to flow onto your neighbor's property inappropriately. We're going to want to make sure it's all managed. Now, you might set it up as a temporary situation, because in the future you have another phase coming. So you might have a temporary basin, and that happens on a fairly regular basis. So somebody's planning a regional sort of situation, but they need to handle all their stormwater so that it doesn't affect everybody around them. So they need to have sanitary sewer. They need to have their electricity and their water. Everything needs to be that those people that buy those houses have to be able to be assured that they're going to have the kind of services expected when they buy a lot in the city of Cedar Falls. So that's what that's talking about. And that final piece is, if there's not any essential connection that's not being foreclosed with that particular phase. So that's the situation where we would be looking at the phasing again and saying, okay, we understand you've got everything set up here, but it would be better if you did these additional 4 lots, because that final piece of road connection there is going to be the critical piece that allows this neighborhood to function. And doesn't, we anticipate if you don't do these last 4 lots, extend the road over to this connection, it'll create problems in the community. And we don't know when your next phase is going to come along, so let's make sure that that critical piece is included with this particular phase. So really, it's pretty circumscribed here. It's pretty just exactly what it means is can it function as as a development all on its own. So the people that buy the lots can be assured that they have the infrastructure there that they're going to need to live in the community.
Okay.
Well, I would entertain a motion anywhere along the lines here. Technically, we're supposed to have a motion before we have discussion, but we can.
Sure. I would move to approve. I think it clearly articulates the partnership between the city and the developer to keep a connected infrastructure for Cedar Falls. So I would move to approve.
I would second.
Motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Further discussion? Questions? I do think it seems to at least give some direction that we're going to be looking at phasing specifically to the developer so that it's thought about in greater detail at the beginning. So we're thinking about those connections and things like that. So I think that's beneficial. And I guess to the point, I mean, it still all comes down to a review of those plats, and you know, we have the choice when we do that. At least hopefully this causes us to be more cognizant of how the potential phasing can happen, so they don't run into problems down the road. So I feel pretty good about the general concept behind this amendment.
I just want to state that I agree that this will help us in looking at the phasing and what is being proposed. I just don't want us to get into a situation where we're discouraging the developers either.
Right.
You know, so I think we have a pretty good handle on it though, and staff does. So anyway, I just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the role as a planning and zoning commission to try to balance that. You know, when the proposals come before us, you know, is it, you know, great benefit? We don't want to shut it down. We want to figure out a way to make it work. So
Right.
Any other comments or discussion? Seeing none, we have a motion to approve, and we'll ask Karen to take a roll call vote.
Okay. Hartley,
Aye.
Holst,
Aye.
Larson,
Aye.
Leeper,
Aye.
Lynch,
Aye.
Prideaux,
Aye.
Saul,
Aye.
Schrott.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right, thank you. So,
Quick question. Sorry, Marty.
yeah, go ahead, jump in.
I like the idea of the additional detail on the roads and design and that sort of thing, and being a little bit more clear about what those expectations are. What's the timeline for some of that stuff coming online?
I can't guarantee a timeline on that. You know, we've got a lot on our plate right now. We will be bringing forward the code amendments for downtown to implement the downtown vision plan. So that's kind of on our plate right now. And so I'm not sure we're going to be able to slide the connectivity standards in before we get to that process. So it's just a matter of staff resources and how we want to do that.
You guys are
So
busy.
there's a lot of things we would like to do. So.
All right, thank you. All right, we have one more item of business tonight, and that's the zoning code text amendment for adaptive reuse of institutional buildings. And who's going to introduce that?
Mr. Seavey is going to introduce that tonight.
All right.
Yep.
You're on,
Bring up the
Chris.
screen here again.
Okay. Some of this will be review of some things that we've discussed previously. We brought this to you on the 26th of August. And so we'll kind of discuss this again. So just kind of review. Back in March or April, we received a call from the owner of a church building that sits in the southeast part of town. As we understand it, a while back, the pastor of the church passed away, and the church has since sat vacant with very few options in terms of allowed land uses. It sits in the R1 residential zoning district, and they have only 4 realistic legal options. One is to continue to sit vacant. 2 is to sell to another church. Another is to convert the use to a public or parochial school. And then the other is to tear down and subdivide into residential lots. The owner of this property was hoping to use the property to host wedding receptions, which is already a common accepted activity under the umbrella of churches and religious institutions. However, without a religious institution, this use would be a principal commercial use that is prohibited by code, even in the R4 zone. It is important to note that institutional facilities are properties with unique characteristics. They are large buildings on large parcels, and they often have some historical or cultural value. So it seems appropriate to cautiously provide flexibility of use while considering the neighborhood context. Let's go to the next slide. So back in April and May, when the City Hall was closed to the public and most city staff were working from home, I had some time to dive into this issue, which involved reaching out to planners in other cities across Iowa. In particular, I spoke with planners at Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, Des Moines, and Council Bluffs. While a number of these planners indicated that they have encountered similar inquiries about repurposing obsolete institutional buildings, only Council Bluffs and Iowa City have pursued ordinance amendments. From these conversations, I'm convinced that we should not add alternative uses by right in the zoning code, but it makes sense to craft an amendment that provides alternatives that are subject to review and approval by the Board of Adjustment. Now, it's a little bit different than what we discussed before, but I'll explain in a few slides. So what we propose is that this be in the form of a conditional use permitting process that doesn't guarantee that a use is approved, but it may be granted by our judicial bodies if it appears appropriate to the neighborhood context. Or I should say not judicial bodies, it's the Board of Adjustment, right? So what are the issues we need to consider in such a policy? First, not all uses are compatible with residential neighborhoods, so the policy should likely limit the alternative uses that can be considered. Second, nuisance issues such as noise and traffic will be important to evaluate when considering the alternative uses. Third, allowing an opportunity for neighborhood input will be important in the review process. So we need to give notice to adjacent property owners. And fourth, depending on the proposed use and the characteristics of the site, additional conditions may need to be imposed, such as additional parking, limits to hours of operation, restrictions on use of amplified sound, additional landscape screening and buffering to ensure compatibility with the neighborhood. So, what uses are compatible and likely should qualify for consideration? These are the ones the staff has identified, and we'll review the code in a few slides where you'll see how these general categories are represented. Pictured here is a church on Main Street that we discussed previously that was converted to a residential use. So that's a positive aspect of this. But obviously it was in the R4 zone, and so that was allowed by right. So anyway, moving on to the next. As far as let's see, as far as criteria for evaluation, these are some listed factors that are important to consider. Each case should be considered on its own merits, and it makes sense to evaluate a use against the backdrop of the uses that were previously permitted. churches and other institutional uses are not without traffic or noise. Some have youth activities that go late into an evening. These factors will help identify conditions that the Board of Adjustment may find appropriate to impose. Depending on the evaluation of the proposed use, the Board of Adjustment may approve a proposal, deny, or approve with conditions. So kind of some important aspects of that. So let's get into the code. This code language. So I'm not going to read it word for word, but we'll point out some highlights so you're aware. This language was reviewed by our city attorney, and it was by his recommendation that we use the Board of Adjustment, which is the standard in Iowa. His recommendation was not surprising because all the codes that I reviewed, which I reviewed more than just the ones where I spoke with planners. There was more research that has been done on that. All of the codes that we reviewed utilize the Board of Adjustment in special exception and conditional use cases. So we wouldn't be really breaking from that in terms of how the legal system in Iowa is set up for this. The applicant will bear the burden of proof that they meet all the requirements as set forth under this section. As far as precedent, other cases have no bearing on the decision of future cases and cannot serve as support for reasoning for approval of a request. This is because all neighborhoods are unique and it will be important to judge each case on its own merits. For instance, a decision about a church close to downtown should have no bearing on a decision about a church in the Cedar Heights neighborhood. Point D here indicates that all regulations of the base zone and overlays still apply. So next slide. This part gives room for other conditional uses to be added in the future, but this one about adaptive reuse of institutional buildings will be the first on the list. So here we have a description of the situations that apply and essentially the potential requirements that may be imposed as conditions if a use is granted. So things like additional screening, landscaping, operational limitations, hours of operation, things like that. So next slide. Here's the official list of qualifying uses that we propose in the code. These are lower impact uses and potential amenities to a neighborhood. Many of these reflect the kind of activity and benefit that a church typically offers a neighborhood. And I don't know if we want to kind of discuss them a little bit more, but hospitality uses, conversion to a multi-unit dwelling, community service uses. I think daycare facilities will be an important one for people in a neighborhood. Specialized educational facilities. If somebody were to do a tutoring service or something like that that benefits children and families, that would certainly be appropriate. So. So let's talk about criteria for evaluation. As requested at the previous meeting, in the staff report, I included some sample code language from Iowa City and Dubuque. The Dubuque example listed some very standard language that we're modeling after here. Some of this is specific to the intended situation and some is standard for protecting the interests of those in the neighborhood. This is really where the burden of proof comes in for the applicant. And they may even propose conditions and ways in which they can best fit into the neighborhood. Next slide. Lastly, these are the required submittals so they can fulfill that burden of proof. This will require a detailed letter describing the previous use and the proposed use with the appropriate details, a site plan illustrating the proposal, a list of landowners in the surrounding neighborhood within 300 feet, and anything else that may be applicable. I think that's about it. at this point, we recommend approval and that this be recommended to council. But we can certainly discuss. If you have any questions, I'm right here.
Thank you, Mr. Seavey. Well, commissioners, is there a motion or questions?
I would move to move forward with this.
So move to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. And the discussion on this. I'll just say that I really like the way this is put together. And I think going through the Board of Adjustments, I can understand the reasoning behind that. And I think that's good. I like the list of potential uses. And we do have the ability to expand that, like you said, over time. If other things become evident, it could be amended. But I think all those uses are potential reasonable uses for like an old church like that. And so I think it really gives us a lot of flexibility to, for some smart adaptive reuse of a facility that might go unused otherwise. So I think it's a really good thing. Another thing I liked about it too, but by going through the Board of Adjustments like you've got it set up, is the clause that it's not setting. So you do one a unique project, and it doesn't set a precedent for everything else. It's clearly stated there that it's not precedent setting, which I think is important because, as you mentioned, buildings can be quite different, and they're in quite different neighborhoods or environments, and so you don't want to do one thing that might seem really strange somewhere else and use that as a precedent. So
Right.
I really like the way it's structured. I think that's really beneficial. Anyone else?
I like the idea of us offering those options for those particular
Yeah.
properties, because who knows, we may have more of that coming up. So and I love the idea of the using them to fit into the neighborhood and all of that. So
Well, I think the other important aspect too is that through that Board of Adjustments process, the neighbors' input is strongly considered, and they're to be notified. And I think the Board of Adjustments then will weigh serious concerns that the immediate neighborhood would have. I think is an important factor in making that decision too. So I think that's super important. Any other comments, questions, discussion?
If there's a submittal prepared, what's the staff review process for something like this compared to anything else that would either go to the board or to the commission?
It would be very similar to anything that we, really bring before this commission. We would have a kind of a deadline date by which they need to have that to us, and I think there's a 2 or 3 week period where we can put together our staff report and have that prepared for the Board of Adjustment to hear. So
it's not unlike what we do here for planning and zoning, right? You do a full scale report, you make a recommendation, and then you bring it to the Board of Adjustment, and then they have a hearing on it and review it and make and vote on it then.
Yep, that's exactly right.
The Board of Adjustment meets once a month to consider requests for special exceptions, conditional uses, variances, and all the Board of Adjustment meetings are public hearings. And so there's a notice in the paper, and surrounding properties property owners are notified. So there's usually typically only one meeting where they make their decision. Now the board would have the ability to, if there was something particularly controversial or something that they felt like they needed more information to be provided, they would have the option to continue that. So in a lot of ways, it's similar. They are considered a quasi-judicial board. So they're not making legislative decisions, but they're making decisions based on individual properties and things brought forward for particular variances on a particular property or conditional use like this.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Further discussion? Seeing none, I guess Ms. Howard will ask again for you to take the roll call vote on the motion, and the motion is to approve.
Hartley,
Aye.
Holst,
Aye.
Larson,
Aye.
Leeper,
Aye.
Lynch,
Aye.
Trudeau,
Aye.
Saul,
Aye.
Schrod.
Aye.
Voting aye.
Great, so that motion carries. That concludes our regular business for this evening. Is there any commission updates, Karen?
I wanted to let you know that we, as I mentioned previously, we will be bringing forward the downtown code in the near future. First, before we do that, we'll want to meet with the commission, and we might even do that at your next meeting, depending on how much you have on your agenda. But we'll want to go through what we think would be a good process for reviewing that large piece of code so that, you know, it makes sense to you. And I just want to discuss that, how we were going to do that process. So we'll do that and discuss that with the commission. We'll also have a session with the council to talk about that process, and with Community Main Street as well, because they are an important partner too. So just so everybody understands how that will happen. So that'll be coming up soon. And the other thing I would like to just let you know, we never know how the conditions of the pandemic are going to change over time. So just like last time, we thought we were going to be meeting in person, and then, the cases spiked. So it was determined that we'd go back just to fully Zoom meetings. So I will just let you know before the next meeting how we're going to handle the meeting. But so I apologize that we jumped the gun last time, but we're just trying to respond and be safe in the community.
You're doing the best you can. Appreciate that. Well, if there's no other business, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I have one quick question about the downtown thing. Is there, once it gets to a good stopping point anyway, would it be possible to just send that out separately in advance so that we could have some time to study it?
Yeah, so we'll go, that's one of the things I'll go through when we talk about it the next meeting, is how that process will go. And we'll certainly give some time, or it'll be presented to the community, and there'll be a public review period where everybody will get a chance, and in the commission to really dive into the details of that and understand it better. So we'll give plenty of time for all that to occur.
Okay, very good. Sorry, Marty.
No, that's fine. You're great. Any a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, signify by aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for all your good work tonight. We'll see you the next time.
Thank you, everybody.